seminar on the theme of escape, imaginary lands, and magical reality. I'm Lloyd Kramer, the Director of Carolina Public Humanities, and I want to again thank all of our friends and supporters who have helped to make these events possible. I won't go over all of the plans of the seminar again, but I will remind you that we'll have 2 sessions this evening, and we will continue the discussion that we launched last night. I remind you that we began our seminar yesterday with insightful discussions of imaginative stories, of storytelling and literary fiction. And our first speakers, Brian Sturm and Eliza Rose, led us through an outstanding engagement with the question of how we imagine the world through storytelling and through fiction. And as they explained, stories can offer pleasurable escapes from the complexities and setbacks and fears of our lives. And they also suggested that a new kind of self-knowledge can emerge from storytelling and story listening. And this self-knowledge may be one of the reasons that stories have such appeal in times like a pandemic or a crisis. So we're going to continue our discussion of these issues today during a first session on the themes of fantasy films. And then we're going to have a concluding session in which all of our panelists will offer additional perspectives on the literary and cinematic themes that we've been examining. Our third speaker in this seminar is Rachel Shavitz, and there is information about Rachel on the biographical summary that you received when you registered for this seminar. But I want to note especially that Rachel served Carolina Public Humanities for more than 4 years as our Associate Director for State Outreach and Strategic Partnerships. And although Rachel is now living in New Zealand and working there as a communication director for Oxfam, she remains connected with CPH through enduring friendships and a shared commitment to the humanities. So it's a great pleasure for all of us to welcome Rachel back. Among her many initiatives during her time at CPH, Rachel developed new partnerships with community colleges around the state, and she created a connection for programs and collaborations that our colleague Joanna Smith has continued to expand over this past year, even in the time of COVID. I should also mention that Rachel received a BFA degree in film production at New York University and went on to complete an MFA in film studies at Boston University and a PhD in media and communication from Temple University. She's also worked out in Hollywood with the stars, and she was involved in the communications and publicity on films such as Lord of the Rings. So she knows something about fantasies and about the life of Hollywood. Throughout all of her projects and creative activities, Rachel has always recognized the importance of the arts and humanities. And Rachel's expertise in film studies brings an important dimension to the study of the humanities. She's written articles and edited a book on the media, but she carries us beyond written texts into the realm of images and visual communications. We're extremely pleased that she is joining us for this program from New Zealand, where it is already Saturday morning, and where, as in a great science fiction movie, she's already living in a future that will not reach us for at least 18 hours. But meanwhile, giving us a glimpse of the future, she will be talking about the theme of, quote, dramatic distractions, how we use fantasy films to escape reality. And you may send questions via the Q&A tab on your Zoom screen, which is at the bottom of the screen. And I'll convey these questions to Rachel after she completes her presentation. So it's my great pleasure to say welcome back to Rachel Shavitz, the first speaker ever to join a CPH weekend seminar live from Auckland, New Zealand. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Lloyd. I missed you. And your amazing introductions. Thank you for that lovely intro. I want to thank Vicki Breeden from CPH, who got us all here together and sent you all the materials in advance. And I want to preemptively thank Paul Benici from the team who's going to play my clips. We decided it would be better for the clips to be coming from North Carolina and for me to be coming from New Zealand. I'm really thrilled to be here. As Lloyd says, I'm living in Auckland, New Zealand, and it's 11:07 a.m. on Saturday morning here. I'm thrilled to be with all of you. As you heard a little bit in Brian's presentation, the indigenous population here in New Zealand is the Maori people. And today, in any given setting in New Zealand, when someone gives a presentation or a speech as a gesture of respect to the indigenous people, the speaker, whether they're Maori or not, tend to give a greeting or a welcome in the language of the indigenous people, te reo Maori. So I thought I'd give it a try since I'm coming to you from New Zealand and say, kia ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, whakawhatai moto toa. So greetings to all of you, greetings to my fellow speakers, and thank you so much for this invitation. So now I'm going to share my screen and dive right in. All good? Okay. So we are talking about dramatic distractions, how we use films to escape reality. Filmgoers have used the cinema as escapist entertainment for as long as the medium has existed. So today we'll take a look. We're going to start with a really broad look at all the kinds of films that help us escape from our everyday lives and transport us into another time and a place, and focus on a few genres that are particularly good at doing this. So science fiction and fantasy and magical realism. We'll learn a bit about how movies from these traditions have functioned over the years, especially during other stressful periods in our history, and basically just spend an hour or so together living in a world populated with magical wizards and alien creatures. I think it's going to be great fun, and I'm really happy to be taking you on this journey together. An escapist film is any film that provides a psychological escape from our everyday lives, the worries, the stresses, even the monotony of our lives. We want to escape, and any film that helps us do that can be called an escapist film. So one question I'll explore a little bit today is it a bad thing to want to escape? Why do fantasy films have such a kind of low rent reputation as not really taken seriously? Why is it a bad thing to make a fantasy film or love a fantasy film or love a fantasy novel? Scholarly and critical literature is replete with references to fantasy films and novels as amusement and childish and distractions, and my very favorite, cowardly escape from real life. I feel like all of this is a little bit harsh. I think it's not quite fair to our traditions, and luckily others have an alternative perspective. Clyde Northrup is a Tolkien scholar, and he thinks literature, fiction, and film has the ability to remove ourselves from the pain, the suffering, the sorrow, and the injustice of the ordinary world. We need this kind of escape in order that we can regroup and again, face the miseries and pains of our ordinary lives. We see this ebb and flow reflected in the characters of the films we love. They may escape one perilous situation with only a brief rest to tend to their wounds and regroup before they have to get back in there and fight monsters and miseries again. We may fight our own monsters every day, and just like the heroes in our films, perhaps we need that respite, that break, in order to have the strength to fight another day. Expanding from this perspective, one can argue that escaping into these stories offers the same benefits to us, the viewers, as escaping danger does to our fictional characters. So when we watch films, we identify with the characters, even if they're very different from us. We travel alongside them on their adventures for good or ill. And when they're startled by the bad guy or the dinosaur, we're startled too. When they're frustrated or scared or despondent or exultant, we experience these emotions vicariously alongside our characters. So the value to be gained from identification, from watching characters like these on your screen, is twofold. One, we just get the respite of escaping into a thoughtfully constructed narrative. And then two, we get to vicariously escape a stressful situation alongside these characters. So we share in the relief they feel in their escape. And though the emotions we may feel alongside them are created by fiction, we feel them as if they are real, as if they're created by our reality. Action movies do this too. So psychologists have long suggested that a high octane movie like some of these give us a safer adrenaline rush than what we might seek out in real life. And certainly during COVID times, when we're less able to get out and get our adrenaline fix, these films fill a gap. So heroes like maybe James Bond or Indiana Jones, or spies like in the Mission Impossible series or the Bourne Identity series. And basically any movie starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson from the lower corner here, they're all going to give us that quest, that near-death experience, that escape from certain death, and give us all the rush, none of the risk. The next level of this phenomenon is us as viewers escaping our own lives by identifying with characters who are they themselves escaping their own lives by watching Hollywood movies. It's pretty meta. So we've got Woody Allen's The Purple Rose of Cairo and Frank Darabont's The Green Mile. In these films, both characters are escaping their miserable lives by going to the movies and watching a Hollywood film. And maybe the top of the heap would be this film, Dancer in the Dark, directed by Lars von Trier in 2000 and starring Icelandic pop star Björk. So this film won the Palme d'Or, and Björk won the Best Actress prize at Cannes the year it came out. And it is about this character, Selma. She's a Czech immigrant working a really monotonous, terrible factory job. She has a degenerative eye condition. She's going blinder and blinder throughout the film. And her son has the same condition. And so she's hoping to earn enough money at this terrible job before she goes blind to pay for the surgery that will prevent her son from going blind. Pretty grim. She goes to the movies all the time. She loves Hollywood. And as she's getting blinder, her friends have to just describe the on-screen action to her. But she still loves it. And when her life gets so depressing that she just can't take it anymore, she escapes into the Hollywood films. So Paul is going to share the trailer from Dancer in the Dark.
You like the movies, don't you?
I love the movies.
Yeah?
I just love the musicals.
But isn't it annoying when they do the last song in the films, though?
Why?
Because you just know when it goes really big and the camera goes like out of the roof and you just know it's gonna end. I hate that. I would leave just after the next to last song and the film would just go on forever.
I just want to make sure that you fully comprehend what this means. Once this starts, there's no stopping it. Do you understand me?
Yeah, I'm prepared.
Please kill me. You just be my friend and show some mercy, please, and just kill me.
Why did you kill him?
He asked me to.
I just did what I had to do.
I got little games I play when it goes really hard. I just start dreaming and it all becomes music.
I've seen what I choose and I've seen what I need, and that is enough to what more would be great. Get a crash car, rocket bouncer, come crash that, bam!
Selma Zeskova, do you have any last words?
I used to dream that I was in a musical, because in a musical, nothing dreadful ever happens.
No matter how unfamiliar the characters' lives might first seem, we find points of commonality, ways to identify and connect. Their escape becomes our escape. But we don't need to see characters actually escaping something in their narrative for us to benefit from that psychological escape, to take a break from the thoughts of our everyday lives. But how do filmmakers get us to forget about the real world, enter into these other times and places? What tools and techniques help make it possible for us to escape into this fiction? I would argue that even with the most creative script, the most convincing actors, and the most gorgeous expert cinematography, a film will not be as able to help us forget about the real world and immerse into a new one without incredible production design. This is a broad category that encompasses set design and construction, props, hair, makeup, visual effects. Some of you may recall that I had a past career in this world and I worked in set design. And so I just couldn't resist to take a chance, to take this opportunity to share with you some of the truly magnificent work being done by this industry over the years. For example, on this slide, this is a miniature build of the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry from the Harry Potter series. I included this slide intentionally for CPH's own Vicky Breeden because I know she's a Harry Potter fan. So that is an incredible work of art that has been built for the films. In the early days of cinema, production design was basically the only way that the films were able to transport viewers to another time or place. These stories may have featured historical figures, kings and knights, or fantasy figures like fairies, or popular fictional characters like the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Either way, the illusion is completed. The sets, the wigs, the costumes, each element contributes to creating this other world. And the desire to see another world, one will never live like that of a queen, was just as prevalent a century ago as it is today. Not much has changed in that regard. Especially in the earlier days of cinema, when camera and sound equipment was huge and heavy and unwieldy, it was too difficult and expensive to actually shoot on a real location. So it became the golden era of innovation in production design. This is Black Narcissus from 1947. The film follows an order of nuns that take over a monastery in the highlands of the Himalaya, and it was extremely popular at the time, released in 1947, post-war. And reviews and articles about the film at the time talk about audiences gasping at the beautiful lush gardens and the vistas visible in the film. But of course, it wasn't a world far, far away. They shot on a soundstage 20 miles outside of London and used matte paintings on glass to create that illusion of the Himalayan countryside. 2 years earlier, French filmmaker Marcel Carnet was working under quite different conditions to create Les Enfants du Paradis, the Children of Paradise, released in France in 1945. So this is a sprawling epic film in 2 parts, and it's got all the trappings of the decadent rich mansions and carriages, and then also the seedy underbelly, the prostitutes and gamblers and pickpockets of the streets of Paris in 1830. The most amazing thing about this set is everything you're looking at on the screen is a build. This is a 1/4 mile long fabrication for the film, built in Vichy occupied France during the war And the production designer, Alexandre Tranier, was a Jew being sought by the Nazis working in secret to create this 1/4-mile long, unbelievable work of art. It was so detailed and believable that it was able to provide wartime audiences in France with a much welcome escape from their current lives back into time, into the 1830s of Paris. As technology evolved, we didn't have to build sets to scale anymore. They didn't have to be the size that they would have been. We were able to combine miniature set builds with digital special effects. So this is a really cool New York City street set build. So this is the set with our production designer here in the foreground. And in the film, it looks like this. Pretty cool, eh? So just to be clear, I am not recommending this film, Godzilla from 1998, not a great film, but really great sets. So I wanted to highlight that. And of course now, for better or worse, we've gotten to a point with digital technology that we can create a set that is entirely computer generated, like this truly incredible landscape from 2009's Avatar. Really, really beautiful. This is a sneak peek at the quote unquote set for Avatar 2, which is currently shooting here in New Zealand. While yes, New Zealand is very beautiful, it looks nothing like this because this is a complete digital fabrication. New Zealand actually looks a lot like this. Excuse me. I took this photo a couple of weeks ago on the set of The Lord of the Rings, which is still open to the public here, about 2 hours south of where I live in Auckland, in Hobbiton. As Peter Jackson, the director of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, knew well, having great locations can go a long way to helping sell the illusion of a faraway or fantasy world. Sometimes you don't need a ton of digital effects to whisk your viewers away into an exotic land. Once film equipment evolved to be more mobile, directors were able to shoot on location. And at first, they really wanted to show off some of the fancier architecture and beautiful historic sites of Europe, such as Roman Holiday in 1953. We also got a gorgeous look at Italy in The Talented Mr. Ripley from '99. Wes Anderson is known for showing off places off the beaten path, such as the locations in India he highlighted in the Darjeeling Limited in the lower left-hand corner. And then I wanted to share a quick story about the film The Beach from 2000. So this was a film set, shot on location on a tiny island off the coast of Thailand called Koh Phi Phi. The film was pretty popular among young people and backpackers and those sorts of adventure seekers. And once they figured out where the film was set and shot, they descended on this little island, and the Thai government eventually had to close it off to the public for fear that all of these vacationers and fans of the film would destroy the natural beauty of the place. And so the film was so successful in whisking people off to another location that people sought out the actual location itself and almost destroyed it. I'll also argue that escapist films could be a film set in contemporary times, nearby locations, featuring fairly ordinary characters, but is still able to transport viewers out of their lived reality and into an escape for a bit. So critics and audiences alike really, really loved the 2017 Best Picture Oscar winner, Moonlight. Not necessarily because it told the story of another time or a world, but because it told a story of Black characters that were not suffering. They were not slaves or servants. This film stood out because it was so different from the Black stories we so often get out of Hollywood, in no small part because it was written and directed by Black filmmaker Barry Jenkins. Because it was so different from the usual stories we get, it allowed audiences a chance to escape, and in so doing, live in another world for a few hours. Production design might be incredible and epic, or it might be the smaller details, the props and the costumes. Maybe it capitalizes on a great location or on the technological advancements of special effects. But it all comes together to create a complete world, one different from our own daily world in some way. And because of the combined efforts of countless artists and craftspeople, we are much more easily convinced. We can suspend our disbelief and successfully enter into another world. So which genres make it easiest for us to escape? Perhaps it's those that transport us to other universes. So we'll explore a few of these genres, namely science fiction, fantasy, and magical realism. But I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of slicing and dicing films and trying to decide if they're more accurately sci-fi or definitely fantasy. I don't really see the value in doing that. Heaps of films have sci-fi elements and fantasy sequences, and filmmakers mix and match, and you get hybrids, and I don't think they fit cleanly into one box. So the label is not the important thing. I'll show some films that are fantasy and some that are sci-fi and some that are combinations. The important thing is how they function and what they do for us as viewers. So we'll start with science fiction. So these films tend to use speculative or science-y ideas, right? So things that are not fully accepted by the mainstream, but are related to science in some way or technology. So if we were together, all of us in a big room in the CSLD, I would ask for ideas. I would say, so what's some ideas of speculative science? And you guys just shout them out at the screen and I'll pretend like I hear you. So like aliens, yeah, absolutely. Some people are convinced that they exist. Some people do not think they exist. That would certainly qualify as something sci-fi would talk about. Time travel, fully sentient artificial intelligence and androids, all these types of things are speculative science, the kinds of things that sci-fi films might be about. So many monster movies like Godzilla or Frankenstein, you might think, oh, well, those are like horror films or they'd fit into some other category. They usually have speculative science as their foundation because the monster in question is created by human experiment or an accident. So the films use their futuristic or otherworldly settings to explore issues much closer to home. Social or political problems of the day, or even broader philosophical questions like what it means to be human. Sci-fi author Sir Arthur Clarke, who co-wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey, said, quote, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." So I love this idea. Filmmakers can invent things for the movies that seem super far-fetched and futuristic at the time, even magical. And this phenomenon can help us deal with our anxieties around technology. We might get used to a terrifying concept like, say, traveling off of our planet into outer space by exploring it over and over in science fiction novels and films. So in the upper left corner, we see a still from Trip to the Moon, which was released in 1902. We didn't actually make it to the moon until 1969. So we got a lot of time to get used to the idea and deal with our anxieties and fears about what that might be like and be prepared when we actually catch up, when the technology catches up and we can accomplish it. In the lower left-hand corner is a still from 2002's Minority Report. It was amazingly prescient in imagining technologies that would be available. It is set in 2054, and already in 2021, we have many of the super futuristic seeming technologies featured in the film, like touch screens, which he's showing in this clip, driverless cars, voice-activated homes, personalized digital ads. All of these things were not possible at the time, but are absolutely a part of our cultural mainstream now, if not our everyday lives. Sci-fi films introduce us to the unfamiliar, the new technology or the alien life form within a setting or context of the familiar. We recognize aspects of our lives, our world, and that grounds us and makes it easier for us to accept the fictional elements. So once we're grounded in our familiar setting and accepting of these new elements, we have successfully entered into this world. And once we're here, sci-fi films present us with the problems that we're grappling with in our everyday lives, but because they're in this new world, we can wrestle with these issues at a comfortable remove. For example, the monsters that were very popular in the sci-fi movies of the 1950s often represented nuclear holocaust and anxieties about the bomb. Godzilla representing a bomb, nuclear holocaust. Yeah, I can totally see that. Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, which came out in 1968. The primary villain is this all-seeing eye here, Hal. He is the artificial intelligence that powers the spacecraft. He represents human fear that computers or robots will replace humans. And this is a fear that is explored and borne out in the film when Hal stops obeying his human orders and goes rogue. And then my last example on the right-hand side is from a film many of you maybe have not seen. It's called District 9. It's a US, New Zealand, South Africa co-production. And it's one of only a handful of science fiction films that was nominated for the Best Picture Oscar the year it came out. I am not going to introduce the film. I just want Paul to share the trailer for District 9. And I'm sure you'll be very clear on what contemporary social issue the filmmakers were hoping the film would help us grapple with. So Paul, let's see the trailer from District 9.
Nobody comes back late at night anymore. They have more security.
The government noticed that they were moving into new areas. That's when things started to get out of hand.
They don't belong here.
They're spending so much money to keep them here when they could be spending it on other things. At least they're keeping them separate from us.
A lot of bad things started to happen.
They must just go. I don't know where they go. They must just go.
We're at the breaking point. People are living in fear.
Why are you here? Why don't you just leave? How do your weapons work?
I just want everyone watching this right now to learn from what has happened.
This film is a great example of the way sci-fi films function. Through incredible production design, we are immersed into a world that is recognizable and familiar, but with this alien element, in this case, actual aliens. And in this world, we can see the way refugees are being treated around the world at a remove, with enough space that we might not immediately look away and seek escape from that reality. We might actually engage with the issue because it's at a distance. They're aliens, they're not humans. And as we learn more and more about these refugees and the humans who police them, we get into a deeper philosophical question. What does it mean to be human after all? Who is more human in this story? These crazy looking creatures or the humans that we're used to? It's awesome film and definitely worth your watch if you haven't seen it. Next up is magical realism. So this is a style of fiction with magical or supernatural elements presented in an otherwise completely mundane real world setting. So instead of creating a science fiction world, this is our world, super boring, but with some magical elements tossed in. The major difference I see between science fiction and magical realism is that sci-fi at least attempts to explain the craziness. So Godzilla is a prehistoric creature that was awoken by atomic bomb testing in the ocean, and now that's why he's here. So maybe a totally crazy, far-fetched reason, but at least they're trying to explain it with some science or technology. Magical realism is not trying to explain it. There is this great Mexican-American author, Luis Leal, and this is his quote down at the bottom. If you can explain it, it's not magical realism. We're not dwelling on the hows or the whys. We're just rolling with it. So let's take a quick look at a scene from 2005's Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And we'll see how our young heroine Lucy reacts when her mundane world bumps up against a magical one. Sorry, I needed to unmute myself. So back into it. This scene, I love all the mundane details, the fly that's stuck in the window and the mothballs that roll out of the cupboard. This helps ground us in this world that's recognizable. We've all seen the fly buzzing around that's trying to get out the window. So we're in, we believe that this is a place. And then when Lucy comes out of the back of the wardrobe into this portal, into this other world, we're on board. We're ready to go along for that ride because our foundation has been established and it's nice and strong. Once we're here, once we're committed, we're in this world, we're ready to deal with the tougher issues, sacrifice and betrayal and forgiveness, big themes that come up in the course of the film that we can handle and deal with and wrestle with in this setting that's at a remove. I hope that you're ready. You're going to come along with me further, one more step on this ride into the world of fantasy. So these are films that maybe have no recognizable elements from our world. Different creatures, planets, languages, cultures, histories, they all populate fantasy. And so the production design really has its work cut out for it. It has to sell this idea of a completely new place. Fantasy novels and films, of which the Lord of the Rings trilogy is an exemplar, both of novels and of film, they tend to feature really clear villains and heroes. They're obviously good or evil. So this is Sauron, the villain of the Lord of the Rings. He's wearing that all-powerful ring on his finger. He has no backstory that might help us understand his motivations. It's not like he fell on hard times and he was the victim of some tragedy, and so maybe we can understand where he's coming from. He's not complex. He's not a flawed anti-hero that's done some good and some bad. He's just a massive evil creature with blades on a helmet that wants to take over the world. So you're not supposed to identify with him. You're not supposed to root for him. It's really clear what side we're supposed to be on. And this bears very little resemblance to how the real world works, right? Evil is usually a bit more subtle. People are more complicated and changeable. Fantasy gives us a break from trying to figure out if people are good or evil. It's really clear. We know who the heroes are. Here's our hero right here. This is Frodo. He is a small hobbit tasked with a seemingly insurmountable mission of trekking across kingdoms into the most dangerous place in his world to take that ring and destroy it before that villain, Sauron, can get his hands on it and take over the world. Okay, so as far as storylines go, maybe not that relatable. As far as worlds go, maybe not that familiar. So what fantasy films lack in familiar foundations, they more than make up for in aspects of the human condition. Maybe details of Frodo's world aren't familiar, but the core elements of his situation absolutely are. Let's take a look. Fear in the face of pain or death. Feeling too small or insignificant to possibly make a difference, to possibly be able to defeat a foe far more powerful than you are. Feeling so overwhelmed by the enormity of the task in front of you that you feel paralyzed about how to even begin. Wishing someone else had this task instead of you. Sam is Frodo's best friend and joins him on his quest. Again, aspects of Sam's situation upon reflection are remarkably identifiable. Sam shows us bravery, the bravery exhibited by some, and by contrast, the panic and denial and inaction shown by others. He reminds us that we're stronger together, that even the smallest and seemingly least important of us can wield incredible power, that sometimes just showing up, just being there for someone is exactly what that person needs. Let's take this notion of the emotional core, the essence of our characters and their situations with us into a viewing of a clip from the second film in the trilogy. The second film is called The Two Towers. All you need to know to set the scene is that we have a king who feels abandoned by his allies. He's under attack by an army of monsters, and there are a few warriors there to help him, but he feels overwhelmed by what faces him. Paul, please play the clip from The Two Towers.
The fortress is taken.
It is over.
You said this fortress would never fall while your men defend it. They still defend it. They have died defending it.
I'm breaking in!
Is there no other way for the women and children to get out of the caves? Is there no other way?
There is one passage. It leads into the mountains. But they will not get far. The Uruk-hai are too many.
Send word for the women and children to make for the mountain pass and barricade the entrance.
So much death. What can men do against such reckless hate?
Ride out with me. Ride out and meet them.
For death and glory.
For Rohan. For your people.
The sun is rising.
Look to my coming at first light on the 5th day. At dawn, look to the east.
Yes. Yes. The horn of Helm Hammerhand shall sound in the deep. One last time. Yes! Let this be the hour when we draw swords together. Fell deeds awake. Now for wrath, now for ruin, and the red dawn!
King stands alone. Not alone. Go hit him! To the king!
So we've got this incredible sequence full of all the fantasy elements, the wizards and the monsters and the knights in shining armor, all the things our critics would suggest is mere amusement and a distraction from our everyday miseries. But we also have this pivotal line delivered by King Theoden. He says, "So much death. What can men do against such reckless hate?" In the wake of a school shooting or a church bombing or an attack on a mosque or a gay nightclub, we might feel this sentiment. We may very well want an escape from such a reality. We might very well wonder what we can do against such reckless hate. And here Aragorn answers, "Ride out with me." He wants the king to fight against the hate, no matter the odds, not for death and glory, but for the people around him who need him to fight for them. Since the dawn of cinema, humanity has fought back against plenty of crises, world wars, recessions, depressions, civil unrest, pandemics, riots, the works, you name it. People often wonder several things about the film industry during these times. Does the industry flourish during stressful periods because people really want that escape and they go to the movies more often? Does the subject matter noticeably change during these times to reflect an audience's desire for escape? So let's take a look. One thing to note going in is how long it takes to get a movie made. So this chart shows the 800 movies or so made in the decade between 2006 and 2016, and about how long it took to get them made. So from screenwriting and the idea to pre-production, shooting, editing, and release, it's about 3 or 4 years. Not a quick turnaround. Of course, it was much different back in the day. In the 1930s, let's say, this is a still from the 1939 film Hunchback of Notre Dame. I'm using that as my example because it's actually different from the usual films of the era. It had this elaborate build, a 3/4 scale cathedral and a medieval village all built around. Even with that elaborate build, they still turned it around in a little over a year. So in the early days of Hollywood, they were much more nimble, much more able to respond to what's happening in our contemporary culture if they so chose. So today, not easy to respond to stuff that's happening in the world. Back then, much easier to respond. So I thought that was interesting. I thought we'd take a look at the era around the Great Depression and see what we could learn. So for our purposes, we're going to start with the Wall Street crash of 1929. The Great Depression continued for roughly a decade. So I thought we'd look at the top grossing, most popular films from about 1930, 31 up through 35, 36, just to get a picture of what Americans were interested in watching in the first few years after the Great Depression. Were they looking for escape into films in a very different time and place? Were they looking for films that helped them deal with the contemporary moment, what they were going through in the Great Depression? Were they even going to the movies at all? Or was the money so tight that they just couldn't make it to the movies anymore? Let's take a look. In truth, in 1930, American cinema attendance dropped by 56%. This may come as a surprise to most people. They think that every other industry died and the movies were the only thing that flourished during the Great Depression. It's true, the movies didn't die, but they definitely struggled much more than people realize. Many studios went into bankruptcy or receivership because of this attendance ticket sales drop. And more than 1/3 of the cinemas, the movie theaters in America, closed between 1929 and 1934. That's a huge hit. Historian Richard Butch notes that the Great Depression halted the promotion of movie-going as an experience of luxury at the movie palace. In its place, price, comfort, and distraction from worries became the selling point. So movie-going kind of went back to its Nickelodeon roots. It was a place where the working class could find entertainment with their precious leisure time and disposable income, what they had. At an average ticket price of about 27 cents, movies still offered a relatively inexpensive way to get that much needed vacation from reality. So even though overall ticket sales were down dramatically, theaters were closing all over the country, people still went to the movies, maybe once a week instead of several times a week, something like that. Movies allowed people to escape from the uncertainties, anxieties, and loss of self-esteem associated with the Depression years. And I think if you used to go to the movies many times a week, and now you're only going once a week or a couple times a month, it makes the movies almost more important. It's more special, it's more rare. And so I'm really curious to see what people saw. What were the big hits of the era that they would spend their precious little disposable income on? Several of the most popular, well-attended films of this time were either directed or choreographed by this gentleman, Busby Berkeley. He was known for elaborate dance sequences, very expensive, complicated set builds, and pioneering some overhead camera angles that resulted in this kaleidoscopic effect where the dancers and the set pieces were moving synchronously. His popularity cannot be overstated for this time. He was in such demand that he directed or choreographed 5 musicals back to back to back to back to back in 3 years, just churned them out. They were all huge hits. The most notable would probably be the 2 from 1933, 42nd Street and Footlight Parade. We have to also shout out The Kid from Spain, which he choreographed all the numbers for, which was the #1 film in 1932. So he was a big hit. This is the lobby card from one of his most famous production numbers called The Human Waterfall. He designed it for 1933's Footlight Parade. And so this poster would have been up in the movie theater months in advance to get people excited about the next Busby Berkeley production number. So I couldn't resist. I really wanted to give you all a chance to see this. So our final clip of the presentation is going to be an incredible feat of engineering and cinematography and athleticism and choreography. Paul, please play the clip from Footlight Parade. Pretty mesmerizing, huh? At the height of the Great Depression, Berkeley was able to spend tens of thousands of dollars building sets and rigorously rehearsing these numbers in order to create something so awesome, you forgot where you were and you couldn't help but be swept away. Berkeley's numbers usually had very little to do with the plot in the films in which they featured. He wasn't trying to tell a story or make a point. He just wanted you to be swept away, and he wanted to outdo himself each time. So each successive number became more and more incredible and more amazing to see. Another huge star of the 1930s was Mae West. In the early 30s, West films were a critical factor that kept Paramount from going bankrupt. So without her films, especially these two from 1933, Paramount Pictures would not exist. And this is a fact they're not shy about. They have a building on their lot named for Mae West. So she saved them. In both of these films, she plays a sort of bawdy burlesque singer. If you know much about Mae West, she got her start on Broadway and vaudeville, and she wrote her own scripts, especially her one-liners, her sexual innuendo, all of her risque content. During the difficult times of the Great Depression, many filmgoers really responded enthusiastically to her. She came from the wrong side of the tracks and still manages to achieve success. I love this quote of her down at the bottom: "The darling bad girl who climbed the ladder of success wrong by wrong." So good. Her pictures function similarly to other films that were very popular in the time, the gangster pictures from Warner Brothers. They were enormously popular in the years right after the crash. And historians suggest that Depression-era audiences felt let down by society. It wasn't playing by the rules that everyone had decided was how it would go. And so they cheered on characters like Mae West's characters and these gangsters who defied the establishment, refused to play by the rules, and took what they wanted and found success anyway. Gangster movies and Mae West vehicles were both negatively impacted by the enforcement of the production code in 1934. This was Hollywood's program of self-censorship that prevented the government from censoring them. No longer could you have gangsters getting away with crimes or bawdy one-liners delivered by an unmarried woman who's flirting with every guy in the tavern. That was definitely not going to be allowed under the production code, and so both of these suffered after 1934. In their place, we got a lot of historical period pieces featuring exotic locations. So our number one film of 1934 was Cleopatra, starring Claudette Colbert. And in 1935, we get plenty of the similar type of stuff, ocean voyages and adventure films set in locations far, far away. Mutiny on the Bounty, starring Clark Gable, shot on location here in the South Pacific, not far from where I am. The last big trend that we'll talk about is related to the Great Depression anyway, is the subgenre called the screwball comedy. So since films can no longer show overt sexuality, this reduced every sort of courtship or love scene into the most dull, boring, flavorless nonsense ever. You couldn't show or insinuate anything. It was really vanilla and terrible. So filmmakers had to get creative. Screwball comedies usually have a fast talking heroine, so I really love these movies. It's some of the best roles written for women in 50 years. They're incredible. All these movies are so good. But what works for Depression era audiences is that we got storylines that allowed characters to explore the issue of class. This would have been something really important to Depression era folks. So in these movies, the upper class are represented as idle, pampered, spoiled. They have no skills. They can do nothing on their own. They're helpless. Meanwhile, the lower class, working class folks have nothing but chutzpah and skills. They're smart, they're witty, they're charming. They can get anything they want. They can pass themselves off as upper class fairly easily because they're so witty and smart. And often we get a love match across these class lines, and the upper class character is constantly getting bailed out by the working class character who is the one who knows how to do anything. So imagine our Depression era audience watching with glee as the upper class character is taught a lesson by the lower class character. Or even if you think about it, audiences got it both ways. They got to see the rich at play, the decadent lifestyle of the rich person, and then watch them struggle and be rescued by the working class. And all of it's tied up in a shiny bow of an opposites attract, witty repartee romance. Mwah, perfect. Of course, maybe the escapiest of all escapist films is Wizard of Oz from 1939, where our heroine literally sings about escaping to a place where troubles melt like lemon drops. So we had pre-code gangster movies or Mae West vehicles that allowed audiences to cheer for the bad guys and break society's rules. We had glittery song and dance numbers with Busby Berkeley or Rogers and Astaire that allowed audiences to escape into a world of beauty and glamour. And then the screwball comedies that do a little bit of both, show off the high society world, but also teach those upper crust characters a lesson or two. Whatever your flavor, most of the films reflected the Depression either directly or obliquely. This allowed audiences to either vent or escape their frustrations. The contemporary films I mentioned earlier, where characters are escaping their terrible lives at the movies, both of these films were set during the Great Depression. So even our fiction about that time supports this idea that during the hardships and trials of the Great Depression, Americans relied on the movies to help get them through. I wonder if we've changed a lot since then. I'm up at an hour of time, so I can just quickly go through my second example, which was looking at the films post 9/11. The top 3 films immediately following, well, I just want to say one thing, sorry. I didn't live through the Great Depression, but I did live in New York City. I was a student at NYU, standing in front of my dorm, watching the 2 towers myself in person. So I feel a little bit more confident talking about this time because I lived through it. And I just want to say that we went to the movies all the time. It was the top of our to-do list in the 6 months following September 11th. And I think that that's not unusual. And I'll show you why in a second with some of this data. So the top 3 grossing films of the year were all fantasy or magical realism: Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and Monsters, Inc. Now, remember, we talked about the timeline, how long it takes a movie to get made. None of these were made in response to a nation in mourning. They were done by September 11th, just waiting for their release date. But man, oh man, we were glad of the timing. It worked out great for us looking for an escape. Something that had nothing to do with terrorists was welcome. What's really interesting is all 3 of these were released after September 11th, and they still managed to be the top 3 films of the calendar year. So it gives us a little insight into how ticket sales were looking in the months after September. Unlike Depression era films, Hollywood avoided explicitly referencing the attack. In fact, it took 6 years before a studio even attempted to retell the story head on, and those films were not well received at the time. Instead, our big hits were just what you'd expect. Heaps of wizards and aliens and some pirates thrown in for good measure. So we didn't get in-depth analysis of the time. We didn't get something that responded to the moment. We got escapists, we got wizards, we got Spider-Man, we got Star Wars. As we come to the end of our time together, I just wanted to take a quick moment to note that other national cinema traditions other than American also have relied on science fiction and fantasy to help audiences escape. Most notably, I think, Japan. If Hayao Miyazaki, this gentleman in the corner, if his Studio Ghibli films are not on your radar, they should be. I think you could start in the middle with My Neighbor Totoro from 1988, and then make sure you also see Spirited Away from 2001, which won the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature in its year, beating out all the Disney and all the American films. His films are truly stunning, hand-drawn animation. They feature strong female characters that are thrust into magical or unusual situations, and ask our heroine and then us by identification to grapple with important issues like nature and technology, or how one can stay peaceful in a violent world. These films are beautiful, and I encourage you to check them out. So whether it's wizards or witches, gangsters or showgirls, hobbits or fawns, aliens or robots, whether you prefer a historical epic or a futuristic adventure, or whether it's a completely alternate universe altogether, I hope you have taken some time and will continue to take some time to escape, to live in these worlds for a few hours full of glamour or mystery or fantastical creatures. It'll do you good to check out of the real world for a bit, and maybe while you're in this other world, you'll come to a better understanding of some of the very issues that you're trying to escape in our world. From all of us here in the land of the hobbits, thank you for your attention, and I am happy to field some questions. Thank you so much. Kia ora.
Okay, thank you so much. We don't want to accuse you of trying to escape America by going to New Zealand, but it sounds like you're living in Hobbit land down there. So we don't have much time here for comments and questions, but we'll come back to this in our discussion because we're going to have a panel discussion in a few minutes. I wondered if you could just comment on whether you think films are even more powerful than, say, literature or historical narratives, or maybe even plays in creating fantasy escapes. Are films the most powerful form of fantasy that human beings have created? What do you think?
Of course, I'm a film person, so I'll say yes to that question, but I have a good reason why I think yes. I think that what film does is combine the elements of so many arts all into one. So we get the acting from a theater production, we get the production design, we get the music, all of these aspects that are individual arts on their own, all combined and all in service of a particular mission, escape into this other world. I think when we read a book, we can absolutely get sucked in and create in our own minds this magical world and visualize it just as well as a film could make it, maybe even better, because our imagination might always be better than whatever our technology can create. But the piece that I think films add that a book cannot is the music and the sound effects. Music works on our guts on a real visceral level and emotional level. And I think that adds such a huge element to film and really does sweep us away in a way that I think is maybe the top of the charts.
Okay, we're almost out of time. I'm going to combine two questions that have come in. One of these is, why do you think dystopian films have become especially popular? And another question, does the experience of watching films alone in your living room on Netflix have a very different impact than being in a theater with lots of other people in a big, big screen? Is it a different experience depending on how and where you watch it? So two different questions, but.
Sure. I'll do dystopia first. I think dystopias are great because they acknowledge our anxieties about what might happen, what's the worst case scenario. And usually dystopic fiction, especially films, show humans surviving and figuring out creative ways to form a new society and fight against the evil or whatever that's happened in this dystopic world. So we get heroism and hope built into the idea of the worst case scenario. So it's actually really hopeful and uplifting because it taps into our fears and then shows humans doing okay in the midst of the worst. Mm-hmm. So that's very popular, and I think it's fairly clear to see why. The question about the theater or the personal experience, the main difference obviously is the presence or absence of other spectators alongside you. People have their own movie theater screens in their houses now. So this idea that like a small screen versus a big screen, it's not really real anymore because people are building their own movie palaces in their basements or garages. So the main difference I think today is whether you've got others with you. And that matters, I think. You feed off of the energy in a room. If everyone's laughing at something, that makes it more funny. If people gasp all together and jump all together, that heightens the fun of getting scared in a horror movie. I'll never forget, Lloyd, one time you and I were 2 rows apart at a really sad movie a couple years ago. And Lloyd's wife, Gwen, and I were like sobbing loudly enough that other people could hear us. And I just felt better about feeling so sad because I knew Gwen was feeling that sad too. We were both sad together. And there's a camaraderie in experiencing something like that with other people. It brings you together in a way that's hard to duplicate in other ways. And I think it's amazing. And it's sad that we can't have it right now.
Okay, well, there are a number of other issues that I want to come back to. I want to conclude this session with a comment from Kathy Kuykendall, who says, is it a fantasy that Rachel will ever come back to us from that distant land? So your escapism may be working for you, but it doesn't seem to be
it's not working for the Kuykendall.
So I just throw that in there as a point. Let me say to our audience that we are going to take a short break now and come back, and we're going to open up the discussion with Eliza Rose and Brian Sturm, as well as Rachel, to explore a number of questions about what is the meaning of fantasy and escapism in the current moment, in our pandemic and our political situation, and in film, literature, and storytelling. So thank you, Rachel. Can you hear the applause all the way to New Zealand? People are dancing in the streets in North Carolina. And I invite all of you to take a short break, and we'll reconvene at 6:30. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
6:30 Eastern time, Rachel, in the North American continent.